Did you know that the strength of your entire home relies on something that you'll most likely never see? Today, we're talking basement footings, which are a critical component that set everything up for success in new home construction. But today we're going to talk about the nuances of why it's such a critical component, how to do it right, and what are some of the things to avoid when taking care of one of the first things that you're going to place on your construction site. Let's get to it. So what exactly are basement footings? They're essentially the lowest portion of the concrete pad that's poured in place on stable soil to ensure that you have a solid footing for your overall foundation and the walls that are going to be extending upwards to our main level. Our footings are going to be the widest portion of our building platform, and this helps to equally distribute the weight of the overall structure across the soil, helping it to prevent any settling as well as any shifting that might occur over time. Some people might think of these as shoes that allow you to be able to have a steady platform so that your house could stand tall. So now that we've covered the practical application of why a footing's in place, what exactly are they made out of? Well, in this case, they're comprised of two main components: rebar, which is usually placed appropriately based on engineered drawings to be able to reinforce the concrete that's poured in place to the appropriate thickness, allowing it to bear the weight of the overall structure. So right now, this is the largest footing detail that we have in the overall scope of this project. And we have a minimum of 18 inches depth of the footing. And inside this footing, we actually have a number 4 and a number 5 rebar detail that allows us to be able to get a ton of rigidity. And in this case, we have the number 4 detail that's residing below with 5 sections that run across the 5'9" width of the footing. And then every 8 inches, we have a number 5 rebar detail that's running perpendicular to our rebar mat on the bottom. And then we've doubled up on that. So we have that 3 inches from the bottom, then 10 inches up, which gives us about 13 inches. And then we have an additional 5 inches of concrete above that to be able to create our total depth of the footing and give it the structural rigidity that it needs to be able to hold this cantilevered wall in place. In addition to the rebar matting that's located in the footing, you can see that we have a number 7 rebar detail that is a J hook that hooks underneath our matting detail that allows us to be able to support and tie our basement walls that will go about 12'3" to the top of the finished floor in place and solidly bonded and connected, associated to the footing below it. Now, as we move on to more of the interior of the home, exterior was that cantilevered wall with the very intense rebar detail that we discussed. As we move to the restrained wall, which is restrained because there's an actual structure that's going to be built in here for the interior living. This is actually going to be a bedroom. We actually don't have as extensive of a rebar detailing, so we have a single mat detail that has number 4 and number 5 rebar, but it only creates a single mat about 3 inches off the soil to be able to help with structural rigidity. And then we have a J hook with just number 4 rebars that come up in an 8-inch wall cavity that help to hold that foundation wall in place and spread the weight of that over a smaller distance, which is 2.5 feet wide with a minimum depth of 12 inches that's required by the engineer. And the last footing that we're going to discuss is our interior footings. Now, this is for our wood frame structure, and so you can see that the width and the depth don't have to be as high. We have a minimum of 12 inches on the depth, and then we have a width of 1 foot more, about 16 inches. And then we have some J hook that's coming up every 4 feet instead of the more confined 8-inch rebar detail that we have for our basement walls. Ultimately, we're only going to be pouring a small stem wall in this location in which to be able to bear our framing members on top of. And so we have much less load that's associated on this footing, hence the reason that it isn't as wide and doesn't have as much rebar detailing as it has a standard detail of 2 parallel number 4 rebars that run the perimeter of the foundation. With every 4 feet, we have a number 4 rebar coming up to be able to attach that to that stem wall. Ultimately, this would be more of a standard detail that you would see on a single level home because you don't have as much weight that's bearing on that footing with a conventionally framed home. One of our most popular videos, which is why our basement's so rare, that you can go check out, that was posted a few weeks ago, we had a lot of comments discussing some of the major benefits of basements, but a lot of people mentioned the problems that they've dealt with basements. And it all starts with the footings and specifically how you waterproof and set up your basement structure for success. And I want to talk about some of the nuances because a lot of people talked about flooding, and obviously we're very fortunate where I build in Arizona to have much more of a dry climate. However, we have massive monsoons that drop inches of rains over a course of a short period of time. So we do need to ensure that when we do have a flash flood type rain event, that we can ensure that all the water that resides near the basement is drained appropriately. And that is one of the main failures that is created by not waterproofing your footings appropriately. And we're not quite to that stage yet, but we have a detail that essentially is going to help protect our footing. We're going to have 18 inches of fill rock, drainage fill rock, that's going to come from the basement foundation base of the footing all the way up. And then our drainage pipe will sit on the top of the footing so that any water that resides on this waterproof membrane will be able to drain appropriately and away from the home. Let's go take a quick peek to show you how we're able to deal with that detail and allow for easy serviceability to be able to ensure that the unit, which will be a sump pump, is always working properly to ensure that these footings stay dry throughout the course of their life. So before we hit the sump pump detail, I want to truly illustrate why we feel it's important to get this detail right of waterproofing that footing. And in short, in a standard footing for, let's say, a single level, we would dig with a 16-inch bucket that would essentially have our footing placed into the soil. In this case, we over-X down to the bottom of the footing so that we have the depth associated and we're able to form that footing in place. And one of the main reasons that we do that is because we want to make sure that we have the appropriate drainage detail associated with the overall footing. And so ultimately, when this basement wall goes up, we're going to waterproof this and put a drainage mat in place. And then we're going to have a 4-inch rigid pipe that sits on top of this footing that runs the perimeter of the home. And we're going to fill this over excavation is what that means, cavity to about 18-inch fill of rock. And then our pipe will sit associated on top of that footing. So any water that resides in this cavity that will be waterproofed will essentially exit through that 4-inch rigid pipe and that drainage mat to allow all water to move away and towards the sump pump that we'll cover next. So it's probably no surprise to anyone that you have one opportunity to ensure that your basement is built appropriately. And the number one culprit of any building structure is going to be water and moisture content. And as mentioned, we're gonna have a rigid pipe detail that allows for any water that resides at the footing level, exit through the sleeving that is associated within the footing and be connected to our sump pump detail, which will allow us to be able to mitigate or get that water out to our first level grading and drainage plan so that that water exits the property and moves appropriately based on that grading and drainage plan to the extreme outfall, which is located in this particular instance on the southeast corner of the property. So other than moisture content and water, which we just covered, the second most common reason for failures is not following the structural engineer's detailing to ensure that these footings are actually supporting the weight that's necessary for the overall design of the home. Now, in this case, we went over the appropriate widths and depths, which vary throughout the home. And in addition to that, we also have some rebar detailing that I'd like to cover as well, which we can reference on one of our plan sets in a later video. But in short, we have certain spacing that's required on our rebar. And in this case, we have a rebar detail for our number 7 rebar that has to be a minimum of 2 inches away from the outside of the wall, whereas our restrained wall, which has our number 4 rebar here, is supposed to be 2 inches from our interior wall. And so you can see that there's a 4-inch gap here that allows for the appropriate strength and rigidity in the wall to be able to accommodate the backfill and the overall construction detail that's required for this new construction home. Ultimately, if you don't follow these details to a T, you might run into issues moving forward within your build. The last thing I want to talk about is some of the minimum thickness and widths. I want to say that those are truly a minimum. And so this minimum width of this footing is supposed to be 18 inches. And we decided to go ahead and pour it at 19 to 20 inches, depending on the overall grade that we had, to be able to ensure that we slightly erred on the notion that our footing was thicker than the actual minimum that was required. And I feel like this is something that's super important. You know, instead of being 17.5 and calling it good, to ensure that you have the appropriate amount of concrete placed to be able to have that support structure for whatever resides above it. In my opinion, overall, if you're able to get the waterproofing details correctly and you follow the structural engineering details to a T, you're not going to run into problems in the future with your basement details, ensuring that you have an appropriate platform for your house to reside for years to come. So while basement footings aren't the most glamorous of the overall scope of the project, and most people might be thinking about the beautiful cabinetry or the hardware that's associated inside the home, it's absolutely critical to get these components right and to hire a general contractor that's willing to go the extra mile to ensure that the details are followed appropriately so that you have a strong foundation for years to come. We appreciate you following our channel. We hope that you found this video informative, regardless of where you're at in the country. And as always, we hope you have a great day.